Financial Planner. Follow us on YouTube.
Starting to look like the central banks are nationalizing the economy. Let's get into the economic collapse financial news. Now, we've been talking about the UK and their economy, and last report we talked about retail and how it is declining. Right now, what we're seeing is the housing bubble. Well, it's starting to deflate. Paul Smith, the chief executive of the UK's largest independent lettings and real estate agency, said the affordability in the UK's property market is now reaching crisis point. If drastic measures are not taken to tame prices, the UK could lose its place as a property-owning democracy. Now, the latest figures are published by the Office of National Statistics reveal that the average cost of a home jumped by $10,000 in June from a year earlier. In the last 8 years, prices have surged by almost 50%. Now, what we're seeing here is a bubble, and it's starting to deflate. Now, what has happened is that these housing prices, they have gone far beyond the peak of 2007. And this is happening out in Canada, this is happening in the US, and it's awful because what's happening here is these bubbles are being blown up, and eventually what's going to happen is the whole thing's going to come down. Now, the number of homeowners in London in the 25 to 29 age bracket, it has dropped more than 50% since 1990. Foreign buyers have virtually cornered the market, and they are now drying up. And demand is sagging right now. In the first 6 months of 2017, first-time buyer registrations dropped by almost 20%. So we're starting to see this happen around the world. It's not just here in the United States. It's just not in Canada. We're starting to see it in the UK and throughout Europe and even Australia. And what we're seeing right now is that by creating all this free money, pumping it into the system, giving it to investment and hedge funds, what we're seeing right now is the entire system, well, it's been blown up, it's a gigantic bubble, and it's going to pop. Now, the United States was out there for a very long time. Since 2008, they've been pushing college quite hard because the central bankers depend on people taking out loans. So what we're seeing right now is all these college graduates, they're having a very difficult time finding jobs. And for decades, teachers, parents, and all different individuals, guidance counselors around the country, they've been repeating the same message to the children. To have a bright future, you need to go to college. And what we're seeing right now, especially in Hawaii, and we're seeing this in many other areas, well, the younger generation, they're not buying it anymore. We see that the University of Hawaii, their enrollment has plummeted by 15%. And in other colleges, we're seeing the same exact thing because what is happening right now is that people are graduating college. Actually, there was one college that people actually sued because they couldn't find jobs at all. And what's happening here is that people are graduating college. They have this huge amount of debt, and they go out and they try to find these jobs, and they just can't find them. And they're stuck with this debt. Now, of course, the government, they've been adjusting the loans where they're saying, okay, we'll go by how much you're making. So if you have a part-time job and you're making an hourly wage, we'll take that amount and divide it over, 15, 20, 30 years or so. This way you can make these small, tiny payments. And we're starting to see a lot of individuals, well, they're delinquent on their student loans right now. We see that Sears, and we mentioned this before, how they're shutting down 28 stores. Well, the death spiral has accelerated. Vendors have halted shipments, and we can see right now that it is not going well for Sears at all. Actually, things are completely falling apart. Now, in regards to durable goods, all of a sudden we had durable goods shoot up last month in July. And this was because of Boeing, where all of a sudden there was a huge amount of orders. This was a one-time thing. Guess what happened later on in August? Well, the orders have disappeared and durable goods have declined right now. And durable goods are like those big ticket items like, washers, dryers, and those type of things. And what we're seeing right now is they continually try to push these things up to make it look like the economy is doing well. And we understand that the economy is not doing well whatsoever. Now, we know that the central banks, they've been creating currency like crazy. And the Financial Times recently ran an article that states the leading central banks now own a fifth of the government's total debt. Now, these figures, they are just unbelievable. Without any recession or crisis, major central banks are purchasing more than $200 billion a month in government and private debt, led by the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve owns more than 14% of the U.S. total public debt. The ECB and the Bank of Japan, their balance sheets exceed 35 to 70% of their GDP. The Bank of Japan is now a top shareholder in 90% of the Nikkei. The ECB owns 9.2% of the European corporate bond market and more than 10% of the main European countries' total sovereign debt. The Bank of England owns between 25 and 30% of UK's sovereign debt. And a recent report by Nick Smith, an analyst at CLSA, warns that what he's seeing out there is that he's saying that this is the nationalization of the secondary market. Now, we know the central banks, they have been monetizing, and monetization is a perfect system to nationalize the economy, passing all the risks of excess spending and imbalances to taxpayers. And it always ends badly, because 2 plus 2 does not equal 22. And we can see right now, this is what's been happening here in this country. This is what's been happening in Europe. This is what's been happening in Japan. And this time, it is not different. I know they keep saying, believe me, this time it's different and everything's going to be okay. No, actually, it's a lot worse, because over time, since 2008, we've put on so much debt. We've pumped so much free money into the system. Actually, it didn't reach the people. It reached the banking system. It reached the stock market. It reached the housing market. It reached everywhere else except into the people's hands. And this is why you see inflation in all of these areas. Now, of course, governments can print all the money they want. We know Mnuchin is already out there saying that, listen, we're going to raise the debt ceiling, so don't worry about it. Well, we already know that's a fact. There's no way that they're not going to raise it, because if they don't raise it, the country's in big trouble. They need to continually borrow money. If they can't borrow any more money, the government doesn't take enough in to pay its bills. Think of a household where they're making $50,000 a year. They have their car payment, they have their mortgage, and they have credit cards of, say, $150,000 or $200,000 or whatever. And you're not getting any type of raise. You're not getting the cost of living inflation raise that you normally get. But the debt is continually being added on. And what happens is, with whatever the credit card interest rate is, 28, 30%, or maybe even 15%, we'll go with that, you can't even make the interest payments. Actually, you can't even put a dent in the debt. And you need to live. And the cost of things keep going up. You borrow a little bit more on credit cards. And guess what happens? Your salary isn't moving, so you're not taking in enough to pay for all this debt. This is what's going to happen with the government. If they don't borrow more, the tax revenue coming in from tax receipts is not enough to pay for everything that they've created. And you know what's going to happen. And this is why they'll never stop raising the debt ceiling. It's kind of a waste of time to even have this argument. Now, what we're seeing here is that this entire system, the way the central bank set it up, it's a no-win situation. There's no way out of this except for a bankruptcy, which is a default, to clear up the debt. And if you look at Europe, if you look at the United States, if you look at Japan and the rest of the countries, we're in a huge amount of debt. And this is completely unsustainable. It will not be able to be sustainable. We're going to hit that point where all of a sudden the tax revenue, the amount of borrowing, is going to have to be increased, and they're going to have to borrow even more. And then you're going to see the debt rise even more. This is what happens in the very end. And you're going to see the debt skyrocket. I mean, since 2008, we came into the financial crisis at around 9 trillion or so. And here we are at 20 trillion 9 years later. The next 9 years, we're probably going to hit 35 trillion. There's no way out of this. They need to continually borrow. They can't stop. If they stop borrowing, the system completely falls apart. And those individuals who make their fortunes off of this type of system, they don't want it to end. They love this system. They make a huge amount of money. But the central bank, they realize that they can't keep this system alive. It's completely impossible. And if it comes down on its own, everyone is going to blame the central bank. Why? Because the central bank is controlling the economy. They're the ones who are telling us we need to raise interest rates, we need to lower interest rates, we need to create the currency. The debt is fine, gold is not really worth anything. And if the system comes down, everyone's going to point the finger at the central bank. So what they're doing right now is they're creating the atmosphere where they can bring down the economy and make it look like it occurred from some other entity. It could be Trump, it could be North Korea, it could be China. It doesn't really matter, because they do not want to be blamed for this. Because remember, their entire business model is built on debt, impoverishing countries, stealing their natural assets, and controlling the countries. This is what they do, and they would like to restart their system. And it looks like they're restarting it in China. This is where it looks like the IMF, the biz, they're concentrating on this new manufacturing powerhouse. The United States, well, their time has come. All the manufacturing has been moved out. We're a service country. Most of the people can't find work. We don't produce that much anymore. And we can see everything is already being moved from the west to the east. And eventually what's going to happen is they're going to bring down the economy. Yes, they might start stimulus here once again. But again, they're going to blame this on another entity. They would like to get us into war because this will cover up quite a bit. And they can say after the war, well, these are the winners of the war. We're going to start the system in this country. The country that has manufacturing, the country that has gold, the country that is the winner of the war. Just like the United States had the manufacturing and everything else. So we can see right now that this is where we are headed, and the central banks are pushing their agenda. Listen, everyone.